Ethan Monroe walked briskly down the bustling city streets, his mind still lingering on the evening's event. He had just left a charity gala, an extravagant affair filled with glitz, glamour, and the who's who of the city's elite, the kind of gathering he had become accustomed to since his meteoric rise to success. But tonight, the extravagance felt hollow. As he passed a small coffee shop near his penthouse, the cold winter air bit into his skin, reminding him just how harsh the city could be for those who had nothing. It was then that he saw her, sitting against the brick wall, wrapped in an old, tattered blanket, holding a little girl close to her chest. The woman looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed and heavy with the weight of the world. Her daughter, no older than 6, nestled in her lap, her tiny face buried in her mother's coat. They sat in silence, their only movement the occasional shiver that betrayed their attempt to stay warm in the freezing night. Ethan hesitated. He'd walked by countless homeless people before, sometimes leaving spare change, other times offering a meal, but never had he felt such a pull to stop. Maybe it was the way the little girl's face peeked out from under her mother's coat, innocent and unaware of how cruel the world could be. Maybe it was the raw desperation in the woman's eyes, a look that silently screamed for help, though her lips remained sealed. Whatever it was, Ethan couldn't just walk by this time. He approached, cautiously, not wanting to startle them. The woman looked up, her eyes meeting his. They were hollow, filled with fatigue and something else. Shame, perhaps. Ethan knelt down, softening his tone. "Hey, I'm Ethan. Are you two all right?" The woman hesitated, pulling her daughter closer as if to shield her. "We're fine," she said softly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the lie. "We'll be all right." Ethan frowned. He wasn't sure what he was expecting her to say, but it certainly wasn't that. He had seen enough in his life to know when someone was on the edge of breaking, and she was teetering dangerously close. "Look, I know you don't know me, but it's freezing out here. I live just a few blocks away. Why don't you both come back with me for the night? Just until you get back on your feet. I have plenty of room." The woman's eyes widened in surprise. Offers like that didn't come often, if ever. She glanced at her daughter, who had fallen asleep in her lap, oblivious to the conversation. The mother's protective instinct was clear. She was suspicious, wary of a stranger offering something too good to be true. I don't know," she stammered. "We'll be fine. We don't want to trouble anyone." Ethan smiled softly, trying to ease her fears. "It's no trouble at all. You don't have to decide now, but at least let me buy you both a meal and some hot drinks. The least I can do is make sure you're warm tonight." Reluctantly, the woman nodded. She couldn't deny the hunger gnawing at her stomach or the cold creeping into her bones. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. They walked together to a nearby diner, a small place still open despite the late hour. Inside, the warmth hit them immediately, and the little girl stirred, waking up with a confused yawn. Ethan ordered food for them, and as they waited, the woman began to open up, just a little. "My name's Sarah," she said quietly, her voice still guarded. "This is my daughter, Lily." Ethan smiled down at the little girl, who was rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Nice to meet you, Lily," he said gently. She offered a shy smile before turning her attention to the food that had just been placed in front of her. As they ate, Sarah explained bits of their story. She had lost her job a few months ago, and without any family to turn to, she had quickly fallen behind on rent. Before she knew it, she and Lily were out on the streets. They'd been staying in shelters when they could, but more often than not, the shelters were full, leaving them with no choice but to sleep outside. Ethan listened intently, his heart heavy as she spoke. No one should have to go through this, especially not a mother and her child. As they finished their meal, Ethan made the offer again. "I meant what I said before. You're welcome to stay with me, at least for a few nights until you figure out the next step." This time, Sarah didn't hesitate as long. The kindness Ethan had shown her and Lily had melted away some of her initial fears. "If it's really no trouble, we'd be grateful." "It's no trouble at all," Ethan assured her. The walk to Ethan's penthouse was short, but for Sarah it felt like a world away from the cold, unforgiving streets they had been surviving on. When they arrived, she was stunned. Ethan's home was nothing short of magnificent. It was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views of the city skyline. She had never been in a place so luxurious. "I'll show you to the guest suite," Ethan said, leading them down a hallway. "It's fully furnished and private. You'll have everything you need." The suite was in the basement, but it hardly felt like one. It was spacious, with its own living area, bedroom, and bathroom. Sarah looked around, wide-eyed, still trying to process the sudden change in her circumstances. She couldn't remember the last time she had seen such comfort, let alone experienced it. This is more than we deserve," Sarah murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to thank me," Ethan replied, smiling warmly. "Just focus on taking care of yourself and Lily. You're safe here." That night, as Sarah and Lily settled into their new space, Ethan lay awake in his own bed, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. He had always been generous with his wealth, donating to causes and charities. But this felt different. It felt personal. For reasons he couldn't explain, he knew he had made the right choice in helping Sarah and Lily. But as comforting as that thought was, there was something else. A nagging feeling in the back of his mind, an unease he couldn't quite place. He tried to brush it off as exhaustion. After all, it had been a long day. Tomorrow would bring new clarity. He hoped. The next morning, Ethan woke early, eager to check on his new guests. When he went downstairs, he found Sarah already awake, sitting at the small kitchen table in the guest suite, a cup of coffee in hand. She smiled when she saw him, though there was a hint of hesitation in her eyes. "Morning," Ethan greeted her. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in a long time," Sarah admitted, glancing toward the bedroom where Lily was still sound asleep. "Thank you again, Ethan. I don't know what we would have done without your kindness." "It's nothing," Ethan replied, feeling a little uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm just glad you and Lily are safe." For the next few days, life seemed to settle into a routine. Sarah started looking for work, and Ethan, who usually kept to himself, found that he enjoyed having company. Lily, in particular, brought a certain light to the house. She was a bright and curious child, always asking questions about everything around her. Ethan even taught her how to play a few notes on the grand piano in his living room, and her face lit up with excitement every time she heard the sound of the keys. Sarah, on the other hand, remained a bit more reserved. While she was polite and grateful, Ethan could tell that there was a weight she carried, something she wasn't ready to share. He didn't press her on it, respecting her privacy, but the more time he spent with her, the more he felt that something was off. One night, about 2 weeks after they had moved in, Ethan woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but as he lay there it grew louder, a banging sound coming from the basement. Groggy and confused, he got out of bed and headed downstairs, his heart racing with concern. When he reached the basement door, it was locked. He knocked lightly, calling out to Sarah. There was no response. Worry gnawed at him. He knocked again, louder this time. After a moment, he heard footsteps approaching, and Sarah opened the door, her face pale and tense. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice shaky. "Lily had a nightmare. She was thrashing around and I didn't want to wake you." Ethan glanced behind her, his eyes scanning the room. Everything seemed normal, but the unease from before returned, stronger now. "Are you sure everything's all right?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. "Yes, of course," Sarah insisted, forcing a smile. We're fine, really." Ethan nodded, though he wasn't convinced. He returned to his bedroom, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Something was definitely off, and though he trusted Sarah, he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling him the whole truth. Days passed, and though everything seemed to return to normal, Ethan's suspicions lingered. The strange noises continued sporadically, and he often found small things in his house moved or misplaced. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but enough to catch his attention. He told himself it was nothing, that he was overthinking things, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. One particularly cold night, Ethan was jolted awake by another loud noise from the basement. It was louder than anything he had heard before, banging, thumping, and what sounded like muffled voices. His heart pounded in his chest as he shot out of bed, grabbing his phone in case he needed to call for help. It had been a few weeks since Sarah and Lily had moved in, and though the odd noises had become a part of his nights, this time it felt different, urgent, almost dangerous. He ran downstairs, still groggy but fueled by adrenaline. The basement door was closed, just like the last time. He stood there for a moment, listening. The sounds had quieted, but he could hear movement on the other side. Something wasn't right. Knocking gently, he called out to Sarah. "Sarah, is everything all right down there?" His voice, though steady, betrayed his growing concern. There was a long pause before he heard Sarah's voice, strained and barely audible. "Everything's fine, Ethan. Go back to bed. I'm sorry if we woke you." He frowned, pressing his ear to the door. The tone of her voice didn't sit well with him. She sounded frightened. He knocked again, this time with more urgency. "Sarah, I need you to open the door. I need to make sure everything's okay." After what felt like an eternity, the door finally opened a crack, and Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale and her hair disheveled. She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Lily had another nightmare," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm sorry for the noise, I promise. Everything's fine." Ethan's eyes flickered past her, scanning the room. The guest suite looked normal enough, but there was something about Sarah's demeanor that unsettled him. Her body was tense, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if checking to make sure something, or someone, wasn't visible. Ethan narrowed his eyes, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. "Sarah, are you sure that's all it was?" he asked quietly, trying not to sound accusatory but unable to hide his concern. "You look scared." For a brief moment, Sarah's composure faltered, and he saw fear flash across her face. She quickly masked it with a forced smile, shaking her head. "It's nothing, really. We'll be quieter from now on." Ethan nodded slowly, though he didn't believe her. "All right. If you need anything, just let me know." He lingered for a moment longer before heading back upstairs, the unease gnawing at him even more now. That night, sleep was elusive. Ethan tossed and turned, his mind replaying the strange encounter with Sarah over and over again. Why was she acting so nervous? Why did the sounds in the basement seem like more than just a child's nightmare? He had welcomed them into his home out of kindness, but now a nagging doubt had settled in his chest. Was there more to Sarah's story than she was letting on? The next morning, Ethan made up his mind. He needed answers. If something was going on in his house, he had the right to know. And if Sarah was in some kind of trouble, he wanted to help. But first, he needed to confirm his suspicions. The strange noises, her reluctance to open the door, the way she seemed to be hiding something, it all pointed to one thing. There was someone else in the basement. That evening, after Sarah and Lily had gone to bed, Ethan quietly installed a small camera in the basement hallway, just outside the guest suite. It was discreet, barely noticeable, and he told himself it was for their protection, just in case. But deep down, he knew he was searching for something, anything, that would explain the growing sense of unease he felt. The next day, Ethan reviewed the footage from the night before. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Sarah and Lily went to bed, and the house was quiet. He fast-forwarded through the recording, growing more impatient as the hours ticked by. Just when he was about to give up, something caught his eye. Around 2 a.m., the camera captured a figure, a man, entering the basement. Ethan's heart raced as he watched the footage. The man was tall, with a scruffy appearance and a rough demeanor. He moved quickly, as if he knew exactly where he was going, and within seconds, he disappeared into Sarah and Lily's room. Ethan rewound the footage, watching it again and again, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man? Why was he sneaking into his house in the middle of the night? And most importantly, why had Sarah lied to him? Ethan felt a surge of anger and confusion. He had opened his home to Sarah and Lily, given them a safe place to stay, and this was how she repaid him, by sneaking someone into his home without telling him. He paced around his living room, trying to make sense of it all. Who was this man? A friend? A relative? Someone dangerous? Unable to shake the growing sense of betrayal, Ethan decided he couldn't let it go any longer. That evening, after work, he went down to the basement to confront Sarah. His heart pounded in his chest as he knocked on the door, his mind racing with possibilities. When Sarah opened the door, her expression immediately shifted from surprise to dread. She knew something was wrong. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Who is the man that's been coming into the basement?" Sarah's face drained of color, and for a moment she was frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him, his patience thinning. "Sarah, I saw the footage. I know someone's been coming in at night. You need to tell me what's going on." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to involve you in this. I didn't know what else to do." Ethan's anger softened slightly, but the confusion remained. He sat down across from her, waiting for her to explain. After a few moments, Sarah lifted her head, her face streaked with tears. "The man you saw, he's my husband." Ethan blinked in surprise. "Your husband? But I thought you said he wasn't in the picture anymore." Sarah nodded, her hands shaking as she wiped her eyes. "I left him months ago, before we ended up on the streets. He was abusive, Ethan. He hurt me, and I had to get away for Lily's sake. But somehow, he found us. He showed up a few weeks ago, and I've been terrified ever since. He said if I didn't let him see Lily, he would hurt us both." Ethan's stomach churned as the reality of the situation sank in. He had taken in Sarah and her daughter to protect them, to give them a fresh start, and now he was tangled in something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice softer now. "I didn't want to drag you into it," Sarah whispered. "I thought if I could just keep him calm, if I could buy some time, maybe I could figure out a way to get away from him for good. But he's unpredictable. I was afraid that if I told you, it would make things worse." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. He understood now why Sarah had been so on edge, why she had lied about the noises and kept things from him. She was trying to protect herself and her daughter, but in doing so, she had put them all at risk. "Sarah, you can't keep doing this," Ethan said firmly. "You need to call the police. You need to get a restraining order or something. This man can't keep coming here. It's not safe." "I know," Sarah murmured, her voice thick with defeat. "But I'm scared. He's threatened to kill me before, and I don't know what he'll do if I try to stop him. I don't know what he'll do to Lily." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing with possible solutions. He couldn't just let this continue. He had to protect Sarah and Lily, but he also had to protect himself. He had been kind to them, taken them in, but now he was caught in the crossfire of something much darker than he had imagined. "I'll help you," Ethan said after a long pause. "But we need to do this the right way. No more hiding. No more letting him come here. We'll call the police, we'll get protection, and we'll figure out how to get you and Lily out of this for good." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "You'd really do that for us?" she whispered. Ethan nodded. "You don't have to face this alone, but we have to act fast. The longer he's around, the more dangerous this becomes." Sarah nodded, her resolve strengthening. For the first time in weeks, she felt like there was a way out, a light at the end of the tunnel. She just hoped it wasn't too late. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was looming, that this situation was about to spiral even further out of control. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and tension. Ethan and Sarah had agreed that it was time to contact the police. They couldn't continue living in fear of Michael, her abusive husband, showing up at the house whenever he pleased. But as much as they had a plan, neither of them could shake the feeling of dread that hung over the house. Ethan arranged a meeting with an attorney to help Sarah with a restraining order, and they planned to call the police the next day. They wanted everything in place, evidence, support, before they made the call that would change everything. Ethan had insisted Sarah stay upstairs during the day, closer to him, so they could keep a watchful eye on anyone coming to the house. They set up a safety plan with escape routes in mind in case Michael showed up again unexpectedly. Sarah spent her days keeping Lily occupied, but the tension was evident in her every movement. Her eyes darted to the windows constantly, as if expecting Michael to burst through the door at any moment. She tried to keep Lily unaware of the danger, but it was clear the little girl was beginning to sense the fear in her mother. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Ethan and Sarah sat together in the kitchen, reviewing the lawyer's advice. It was a detailed plan. Everything from how to file for an emergency protective order to what kind of evidence would strengthen her case. But as they discussed the next steps, Sarah's nerves began to fray. "I'm scared, Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was wringing her hands, her knuckles white. What if this makes him angrier? What if he finds out before the police can do anything? Ethan reached across the table, placing his hand on hers. "You're doing the right thing. The sooner we get the authorities involved, the safer you and Lily will be. You can't keep living like this, always looking over your shoulder." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand what he's capable of. He's dangerous, Ethan. He won't just go away because there's a piece of paper saying he has to. He'll find a way to get to us. He always does." Ethan leaned back, troubled by the fear in her voice. He had seen cases of domestic abuse in the news, but now that he was witnessing it up close, it felt much more terrifying. Michael wasn't just a threat in the abstract. He was a real man who had already terrorized Sarah, and now, by extension, Ethan was involved too. "You're not alone in this, Sarah," Ethan said softly, trying to reassure her. "We'll make sure the police know everything. You've been strong for Lily all this time, but now it's time to let others help protect you." She nodded, but the fear remained etched in her face. They spent the rest of the evening in tense silence, each lost in their thoughts. When Sarah finally went to bed, Ethan sat alone in the living room, staring out the window into the dark city streets below. He had never felt so out of his depth before. Despite all his wealth, all his resources, he wasn't sure he could protect Sarah and Lily from someone like Michael. And worse, he wasn't sure what this man was capable of if he found out what they were planning. The next morning, the mood in the house was somber. Sarah had barely slept, and even Lily seemed subdued. Ethan had called the lawyer again, just to confirm the process. Everything was ready. All they had to do was make the call. But as the day dragged on, Sarah's anxiety grew. She kept pacing the kitchen, wringing her hands and checking her phone. Ethan could see she was getting more and more anxious. He tried to reassure her, but nothing seemed to calm her nerves. Finally, she turned to him, her voice desperate. "I can't do it, Ethan. I can't make the call." Ethan stood up, trying to reason with her. "Sarah, we've come this far. We need to do this. For you, for Lily." But she shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "You don't understand. He'll know, he'll find out, and when he does, he'll come after us. He said he'd kill me if I ever tried to leave him for good. That's why we need to call the police," Ethan said gently, trying to keep her calm. "You need protection, Sarah. They can help." But Sarah wasn't listening. She was trembling now, her hands shaking as she backed away from him, as if the fear of Michael was overwhelming every rational thought she had. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ethan was about to respond when the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, freezing them both in place. Sarah's face went pale, and Ethan felt his stomach drop. Without a word, he moved toward the front door, motioning for Sarah to stay back. As he approached the door, his mind raced. Was it Michael? Had he found out what they were planning? Or was it just a neighbor, a delivery, something innocent? His hand hovered over the door handle for a moment, his pulse pounding in his ears. Slowly, he opened the door. Standing on the doorstep was a man. Tall, with a rough, unshaven face and eyes that held a dangerous glint. Ethan knew instantly who it was. Michael. Before Ethan could react, Michael pushed his way inside, shoving the door open with a force that knocked Ethan back. His heart raced as he staggered, struggling to regain his footing. Michael's eyes were wild, darting around the room as if searching for something. Or someone. "Where is she?" Michael growled, his voice low and menacing. "I know she's here." Ethan stood in his way, trying to block him from moving further into the house. "You need to leave," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. "This isn't your home. You're trespassing." Michael laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "You think you can keep her from me?" He stepped closer to Ethan, his broad frame casting a shadow over him. "You think you're some kind of hero, taking in my wife and kid?" Ethan's mind raced. He needed to keep Michael away from Sarah, but he could feel the man's fury radiating off him like heat. One wrong move, and this could turn violent. "She doesn't want to see you," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice calm. "She's done with you, Michael. You need to go before this gets worse." Michael's eyes narrowed, his face twisting in rage. "You don't know anything about us," he snapped, his voice rising. "She's my wife. Lily's my daughter. You don't get to decide when I see them." At that moment, Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs, her face ashen with fear. "Michael, please," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to leave." Michael's head snapped up, his eyes locking on Sarah. A cruel smile spread across his face. "There you are," he sneered, taking a step toward the stairs. "You've been hiding from me long enough." Ethan moved to block him again, his adrenaline surging. "You're not going anywhere near her," he said firmly. "Leave now, or I'm calling the police." Michael turned back to Ethan, his expression darkening. "You think I'm scared of the police? You think I'm scared of you?" He shoved Ethan hard, sending him stumbling backward into the wall. Ethan grunted as the impact knocked the air out of him. But he quickly pushed himself back up, determined to protect Sarah. Sarah was frozen at the top of the stairs, her hands gripping the railing as if it was the only thing keeping her standing. "Michael, please don't do this," she begged, her voice thick with terror. But Michael wasn't listening. He was moving up the stairs now, his eyes fixed on Sarah, and Ethan knew he had to act fast. He lunged forward, grabbing Michael's arm, trying to pull him back. But Michael was stronger, fueled by rage and desperation. He swung at Ethan, his fist connecting with Ethan's jaw in a brutal hit that sent him reeling. Dazed, Ethan fell to the ground, his vision swimming as pain radiated through his skull. He heard Sarah scream, but it was distant, muffled by the ringing in his ears. Through his blurred vision, he saw Michael reach the top of the stairs, his large frame looming over Sarah. But then, something snapped inside of Ethan. He wasn't going to let this happen. He wasn't going to let Michael hurt Sarah or Lily. Ignoring the throbbing pain in his head, Ethan scrambled to his feet and charged up the stairs, tackling Michael from behind with all the strength he could muster. The two men crashed to the floor, grappling in a furious struggle. Michael fought back viciously, landing another punch to Ethan's ribs, but Ethan held on, determined to keep him away from Sarah. He managed to get Michael in a chokehold, using every ounce of his strength to subdue him. Michael thrashed wildly, trying to break free, but Ethan didn't let go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Michael's movement slowed, and he collapsed, gasping for breath. Ethan held him down until he was sure the fight had gone out of him, then quickly pulled out his phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. As the dispatcher answered, Ethan's voice was ragged, filled with both relief and lingering fear. "I need the police. Now." In the background, Sarah sobbed quietly, her body trembling as she cradled Lily, who had woken up during the commotion. Ethan glanced over at them, his heart heavy with the realization that, even after all they had been through, the nightmare wasn't over yet. But for the first time, there was a flicker of hope. The police arrived within minutes, though to Ethan, it felt like hours. 2 officers rushed in, their radios crackling, immediately assessing the situation. Michael lay on the floor, breathing heavily, his face contorted with rage and exhaustion. Ethan, bruised and battered, still hovered protectively near Sarah and Lily. One officer immediately stepped between Ethan and Michael, while the other moved toward the family, gently asking if everyone was all right. Sarah was pale, clutching Lily in her arms as if her life depended on it. Lily, too young to fully understand, clung to her mother with wide, terrified eyes. The tension in the room was palpable, thick and suffocating. Ethan tried to answer the officer's questions, but his voice wavered from the adrenaline and exhaustion that still coursed through his body. The throbbing in his ribs and the ache in his jaw reminded him of the violence that had just unfolded. But he knew this moment wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of what would be a long, painful process for Sarah and Lily. Michael, still on the floor, sneered at the police as they cuffed him. "This is my family," he spat, his voice laced with venom. "You can't keep me away from them." The officer pinning Michael down didn't flinch. "Sir, you're under arrest for assault and trespassing. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The officer's tone was calm but firm, and his words silenced Michael's protests. Michael was hauled to his feet, struggling against the cuffs, but the officers didn't allow him to move freely. Ethan watched the entire scene unfold, a strange numbness settling over him. He had faced tough situations before in his business life, moments of high stakes and risk, but this was different. This was raw, real. The man who had tormented Sarah and Lily for so long was finally being taken away, but Ethan knew the emotional scars would take much longer to heal. Sarah stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide as she watched Michael being led out in handcuffs. She had longed for this moment, for the day she could finally be free of him, but now that it was here, the reality of it hit her hard. The weight of everything, the fear, the years of manipulation, the violence, it all came crashing down on her. She sank to the floor, pulling Lily close, tears streaming down her face. Ethan quickly rushed to her side, kneeling down beside her. "It's over," he whispered, his voice soft, yet full of emotion. "You're safe now." But Sarah shook her head, her body trembling. "It's not over, Ethan," she said through her sobs. "It's never really over. He'll find a way. He always finds a way." Ethan's heart ached hearing her words. He wanted to promise her that Michael was gone for good, that she and Lily would never have to look over their shoulders again. But he knew that wasn't a promise he could keep. Abusive men like Michael didn't just disappear. They lingered like shadows, creeping into the lives of their victims long after the physical danger had passed. Even with him arrested, the psychological grip Michael had on Sarah was evident. It wasn't just about the man himself. It was about the fear he had instilled in her over the years. The police finished their initial investigation, taking statements from Ethan and Sarah. One of the officers, a woman with a gentle yet authoritative presence, knelt beside Sarah, offering her reassurance. "We'll help you get the restraining order processed as soon as possible," she said kindly. "You and your daughter will be protected. We'll do everything we can to keep him away." Sarah nodded numbly, but her hands were still trembling as she held on to Lily. The officer gave her a sympathetic smile before standing up and heading toward the door, where Michael was being loaded into the back of a squad car. Ethan stood up, running a hand through his hair, still trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. The quiet that now settled over the house was deafening compared to the chaos of moments earlier. The officers reassured him that Michael would be taken to jail and he would not be released anytime soon, especially given his violent history. Still, Ethan knew this wasn't the kind of problem that would be solved overnight. After the police left, the house felt unnervingly still. Sarah remained seated on the floor, staring blankly ahead as Lily dozed off in her lap, her small face finally peaceful after the storm. Ethan sat down beside her, careful not to say anything that might reopen the wounds that had barely begun to heal. "You did the right thing," Ethan said gently after a long stretch of silence. "It's going to take time, but you're free now. You don't have to live in fear of him anymore." Sarah blinked, as if waking from a dream, and turned to look at him. Her eyes were red from crying, but beneath the exhaustion, there was a flicker of something else. Relief, perhaps, or the first hint of hope she'd felt in a long time. "I don't even know what free feels like anymore," she murmured, her voice hoarse from emotion. Ethan reached out, taking her hand in his. "You'll learn, one day at a time." Over the next few days, the process of rebuilding began. Sarah worked with the lawyer to finalize the restraining order, and Ethan made sure every measure was in place to protect her and Lily. He beefed up security around the house, installing new locks and cameras, and even hired a security firm to keep an eye on the property for the next few weeks. He wanted to make sure Sarah and Lily felt safe, though he knew it wasn't just physical safety they needed. It was the emotional safety that would take time to rebuild. But as the dust began to settle, another reality began to unfold, one that neither Ethan nor Sarah had anticipated. During a routine background check as part of the legal process, Ethan received a call from his lawyer that left him reeling. "Ethan," the lawyer said on the other end of the line, his tone serious. "There's something you need to know about Sarah." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What is it?" The lawyer hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Sarah isn't who she says she is." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what the lawyer was saying. "What do you mean? I've known her." "She has a criminal record," the lawyer interrupted, his voice blunt. "Years ago, she was involved in a serious crime. It appears she was convicted of theft and conspiracy, but her husband, Michael, took the fall for it." Ethan's world spun. His immediate reaction was disbelief. "No, that can't be right. She's a victim. She's been running from him." "I'm not saying she isn't a victim," the lawyer said carefully. "But her past is more complicated than she's let on. From what I've gathered, she was part of a group that committed several high-profile thefts. Michael went to prison for it, but there's evidence to suggest Sarah played a significant role in planning the crimes. It looks like Michael took the blame for her, and she used his arrest to escape. He's been after her ever since." Ethan felt sick to his stomach. All this time, he had believed Sarah was the victim of a violent, abusive man, and while that part might still be true, The revelation that she had a dark, criminal past made everything feel uncertain, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "Why didn't she tell me?" Ethan muttered, more to himself than to the lawyer. "People with a past like hers rarely do," the lawyer replied. "But you need to be careful, Ethan. There's more to this story than what she's told you. I suggest you talk to her. Find out the truth before you decide how to move forward." Ethan hung up the phone, his heart pounding. Everything felt suddenly clouded with doubt. He had put so much on the line to help Sarah and Lily, had risked his own safety to protect them. And now, the woman he thought he knew had secrets darker than he could have ever imagined. Later that night, Ethan sat in the living room, his thoughts racing as he tried to piece together the fragmented truth. The woman and child he had saved, the people he had grown to care about, had been running not just from an abusive man, but from a past Sarah had kept hidden. The weight of it pressed down on him. He had to confront her. There was no other way. When Sarah entered the room, her face still lined with the lingering fear of the past few days, Ethan looked at her, searching her eyes for any trace of the woman the lawyer had described. He wanted to believe she was still the person he had come to trust. But the truth had to come out. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with the gravity of what he had learned. "There's something we need to talk about." Her face immediately fell, sensing the shift in the air. "What is it?" Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words. "I know about your past, about what happened with Michael. I know he went to prison for something you were involved in." Sarah's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. For a moment she said nothing, her breath catching in her throat. Then slowly, she sank into a chair, her hands trembling. I didn't think you'd ever find out." The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken truths. Ethan waited, giving her the space to explain. Sarah lowered her head, her voice barely a whisper. "It's true. I was involved in things I'm not proud of. Michael and we did things, illegal things when we were younger. I thought I could leave it all behind, but it's haunted me ever since." Ethan listened, his heart conflicted. He had seen the fear in her, had witnessed her vulnerability, but now he wondered if she had ever really trusted him with the whole truth. "I didn't want you to see me that way," Sarah continued, her voice cracking. "I didn't want Lily to grow up knowing what I'd done. I thought I could start over." Ethan sat in silence, absorbing her words. He understood the desire for a fresh start, the need to leave the past behind. But deception, even born from fear, had a way of unraveling the trust they had built. "I just don't know what to believe anymore," Ethan said finally, his voice low. "You should have told me, Sarah." Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry, I was scared. I didn't want to lose the one person who cared about us." The truth, now laid bare between them, left Ethan with more questions than answers. He didn't know how they could move forward from here, or if they could. All he knew was that the story he thought he understood had become something much darker, and the future was suddenly unclear.